Welcome. We come now to our second study of the book of Jonah. Last week, we considered some introductory matters concerning the book, and we talked briefly about how Jonah's reaction to God's call to Nineveh wasn't without some theological thinking in the background of Jonah's mind. And so Jonah proceeded and did something that was remarkable for someone who is a priest unto God, a prophet unto God. He disobeyed God, but we also acknowledge that Jonah was not naive about the theological consequences of obeying the call of God. He understood that a barbaric nation such as the Ninevites under the Assyrian Empire would be the kind of people that God would use to cast judgment upon Jonah's people, the tribe of Israel, the northern Israel tribe, and his people that he has shepherded and cared for throughout many years in his prophetic and priestly role. As we come to the second study of the book of Jonah, I like to delve a little bit into the book by, again, giving some introductory matters because I think it shapes the way we think about the book in profound ways. And as I've mentioned this in my commentary in the book of Ruth, the initial verses of the book of Ruth dictate much of what will unfold throughout the book of Ruth. And so in these smaller books, you have to be overly attentive to the details that take place in the initial verses so that you can grasp what the purpose of the entirety of the book is. And the Spirit tends to give us some very interesting initial clues to the remaining parts of the book. And so, again, in these smaller books, it's important to understand the opening words. In the book of Ruth, you have the use of an unnamed man. You have Mahlon and Chilion, and you have Ruth. All these names have a particular definition that speak to the way the story will unfold. Jonah is the same way. And we need to look at the book of Jonah through the eyes of faith, understanding that God speaks through the book in a variety of ways, through a variety of patterns. Jonah, in many ways, is a multi-layered book. And the more we look into it, the more we consider it, the more we study its details, the more we will see how Jonah is really connected to the greater narrative of the Bible. As I said before, these books are a miniature. They're small previews of what is to come throughout the scriptures. And that is why I think Jonah is worth reading and rereading, because it gives us a host of layers in a very limited amount of verses. And if you read the book of Jonah, which takes probably less than 10 minutes, you'll realize that the more you dig into Jonah, you will see these patterns unfold. And so the first thing that I think it's important for us to grasp is who Jonah is. We talked about this in our first lesson, but now let's begin defining the language here of the book of Jonah. So we begin by asking the question, what does the name Jonah mean? It's a question we don't ponder much, but perhaps it may have some implication for how we understand the rest of the book. The book of Jonah is a book that in some ways deals with the sea and the land. So it's not atypical for the Bible to define names as a way of giving us a trajectory for the rest of the book. The name Jonah means dove. Jonah is a messenger, and as a dove, he's one who is to go into the land and see what is in the land. And you see this analogy back to the days of Noah, when Noah was on the water for many days with his family and the animals, and he sends a dove to see if there is land, if the waters have receded, if now there is a place for them to rest and begin a new world. Jonah is a dove, and therefore Jonah is called to go into the land, into a new land, to see if there is life, to proclaim life, we might say. But the other clear analogy to dove, of course, is that in the Bible, the Spirit of God, the third person of the Godhead, is viewed as a dove, appears as a dove. And so we could say that Jonah has a very spiritual, a spirit-led purpose by his own name. It is implied by the definition of his own name. And one of the things that the Spirit of God does in the beginning of creation is that the Spirit of God hovers over the face of the deep. The Spirit of God throughout the scriptures blesses the land. The Spirit of God comes and offers a benediction to the land. The Spirit of God is the one who reconciles, who brings sinners together. The Spirit of God is the one who harmonizes creation. And so that's a very important principle to keep in mind here as we consider the book. And all of that is assumed in the name Jonah. But there's another dimension here that is implied with the dove and this connection with the Spirit, is that the word wind is also the same word as spirit, the word ruach. And you remember that at Pentecost, there was a mighty rushing wind that came upon the people. In John 3, the Spirit is like the wind that goes wherever he wishes. And so with that really multi-layered context, and this is the kind of thing we need to do as we consider the scriptural text. We need to see these typological connections that are there in the text, but we very quickly overlook because we're not looking for details. We're looking for big ideas or the narrative for us to consider, but we're not looking at that before the narrative unfolds. God is already giving us hints for precisely how the narrative will unfold. And so we need to see these clues that are there ingrained in the text so that we're able to understand the text rightly. So with that in mind, here are the opening verses here of Jonah chapter 1. Now the word of Yahweh came to the dove, the son of Amittai, whose name, by the way, means truth, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But the dove, Jonah, rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of Yahweh. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid a fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of Yahweh. And then again, this imagery comes back in verse 4. But Yahweh hurled a great ruach upon the sea, a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest on the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Interesting, the use of language here. There's a lot of Jonahs being thrown around here. There is a use of the wind. There's the language here of God using this wind to bring about a particular purpose. And again, this is creation imagery being thrown at us here. This is a recreation taking place as water and land and the sea and the wind all take place in these initial verses here. And what we see is here, as we come to a close in this other introduction, is that Jonah is ultimately in a battle with his own name. He is in a battle with his dove-like, spirit-like name. And you can almost guess who wins in the end here. Jonah is trying to flee from the Spirit, but the Spirit seems to bring Jonah back and teach him lessons again and again and again. And we often think that we always need to have an answer to everything, but the message of Jonah is that when God speaks, we quiet ourselves. We will fight, of course, with every ounce of strength we have to go against divine directives in the scriptures, but in the end, Jonah, his own name, wins. Jonah's calling to be a dove, to be a blessing, to be a faithful wind that comes and offers peace and Sabbath rest to the people. That is what to win in the end. But the story of Jonah, at least in this beginning, is that Jonah is fighting against his own name, fighting against the definition of how God sees him. He's fighting against the Spirit. And as the psalmist says, "Where can I flee from your Spirit? Wherever I go, thou art there." And Jonah will have to come to that acknowledgement sooner or later. Thanks for listening to this second introduction to the book of Jonah. Hope it's fruitful to you. Please feel free to leave a comment on our YouTube page. I'd love to hear from you and any insights or comments or questions you may have. May the Lord be richly with you.